The turkey was getting cold. Steam still curled from the gravy boat, but the air in my apartment was so still it felt like the food was waiting for someone who'd never come. Outside Seattle, rain whispered against the glass, a steady percussion of gray on gray. My phone sat face up beside my plate, dark, silent, useless. No happy Thanksgiving text from Mom. No miss you kiddo call from Dad. Not even one of those lazy family group messages that used to blow up my phone with turkey emojis and bad jokes. Nothing. I stabbed a piece of stuffing and chewed without tasting it. I'd promised myself I wouldn't check social media, but of course I did. Picture after picture of smiling families crowded around glowing tables. Hashtags that screamed gratitude while my apartment echoed with the hum of the refrigerator. One caption caught my eye. "Family is everything." I almost laughed. It was my mother's favorite phrase. I used to host Thanksgiving for them. Last year I basted a 20-pound bird, polished the good silver, and set out the floral centerpiece Mom had designed before retiring from her shop. She'd smiled that day, told me I was finally learning how to make a home. Now 12 months later, the only thing that filled this place was silence. I wasn't angry, at least that's what I told myself. Anger took energy, and I'd already wasted too much of that trying to earn their attention. The apartment smelled like cinnamon candles and loneliness. I poured myself a glass of cheap red wine, listening to the rain thicken outside. It sounded almost like applause, but for what I didn't know. My parents lived 15 minutes away in Shoreline. My brother Caleb probably drove over there earlier with his wife and the twins. He was the golden one, the startup genius, the family pride project. Mom used to brag about him to anyone who'd listen. Our Caleb just raised another round of funding. She never mentioned that his company survived on Dad's loan. I was the reliable one, the teacher who showed up early and stayed late, who mailed birthday cards and paid my own bills. Practical. Predictable. Forgettable. I scrolled through old photos on my phone, half out of habit, half to remind myself that once upon a time I had a place at that table. There I was, carving the turkey while Caleb toasted his success. Mom beaming, Dad's hand on her shoulder. The frame stopped on a shot of me laughing mid-bite, unaware that it would be the last Thanksgiving that felt like family. I locked the screen. The blue light left a ghost image on the wall. The TV in the background played the Macy's parade rerun, all balloons and brass bands, a noise too cheerful for the weight in my chest. I turned it off. The silence afterward was so complete I could hear the radiator ticking. I picked up my phone again and opened messages. The cursor blinked in the empty family chat. Last message, "See you soon," from Caleb. That had been 10 days ago. I typed "Happy Thanksgiving, everyone." Then I deleted it before sending. No one needed my reminder. Instead, I clicked over to Facebook. My stomach dropped. There it was, a post from Mom's page. The Monroe's Thanksgiving spread. The caption read, "So grateful for our family today. Couldn't ask for more." Everyone was there. Dad carving the turkey. Caleb at the head of the table, his wife grinning beside him, kids holding their paper pilgrim hats. Even Aunt June from Oregon. The photo looked perfect. Too perfect. I zoomed in, scanning faces like a detective in a crime scene. Every seat filled except one, the spot where I'd always Saturday. I told myself there had to be a reason. Maybe Mom thought I was working late at the school. Maybe she'd tried to call and I'd missed it. But deep down I knew better. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was a message. Stay away. Be quiet. Let the family have peace. The candles on my table had burned halfway down, wax pooling like slow tears. I blew them out and leaned back in my chair. My chest hurt, not from heartbreak exactly, but from the emptiness that comes after. I'd spent years being the reasonable daughter, the one who didn't make scenes, who covered for Caleb when he missed deadlines or borrowed money he'd never repay. And this was my reward, a silent Thanksgiving and an empty chair. I tried to picture Mom in her blue cardigan bustling around the kitchen, and Dad carving like some holiday commercial. Caleb cracking jokes, soaking up attention. I wondered if anyone even noticed my absence. Probably not. Maybe Mom had told them I couldn't make it, that I was busy or sick. Easier to lie than to admit you've chosen one child over the other. The rain turned harder, hitting the glass like static. I reached for my phone again. Still nothing. Not even from Aunt June, who usually texted me something sarcastic about surviving family holidays. I opened my email instead, hoping for distraction. A new message popped up in my promotions folder. Caleb Monroe and Partners Thanksgiving, gala tonight. My breath caught. Gala, not dinner. They'd turned Thanksgiving into a business event, and my parents had gone to celebrate him. That explained everything. For a moment, bitterness threatened to crawl up my throat, but then something quieter replaced it. Clarity, maybe. The kind that feels like a door clicking shut. I realized I didn't have to fight for a place at their table anymore. Let them toast their success. Let them smile for the camera. I would stay right here where no one could talk over me or ask why I wasn't more like my brother. The phone buzzed suddenly, making me jump. A single text lit the screen from Aunt June. "You didn't go, did you?" My pulse quickened. Go where I typed back, but before I could hit send, another message appeared. "Never mind, just checking. Call me tomorrow." The 3 dots vanished. I stared at the screen, confused. What did she mean? I set the phone down again, the unease settling in my stomach like cold gravy. The apartment felt smaller now, the air heavier. I poured another glass of wine, this time drinking it slower. The silence between the raindrops felt deliberate, like the city itself was waiting for something to happen. I thought about calling June right then, but decided against it. Whatever storm was brewing at that family table, I didn't want to be pulled into it. Not tonight. I turned off the lights and stood by the window. Down below, the street glistened under orange lamplight. A couple hurried past, huddled under one umbrella, laughing. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed and faded. My reflection stared back at me from the glass-tired eyes, half-empty glass woman without a family on the one night built for them. Then my phone lit up again. Group notification, family chat, 23 new messages. The preview line read, "Mom, this can't be happening." My stomach tightened. I hovered my thumb over the screen, every instinct telling me to open it, but I didn't. I left it glowing on the counter until the screen went dark again. I whispered into the quiet, almost smiling. Silence was the only thing I had left, and soon it would be the loudest sound in our family. The morning after Thanksgiving, my apartment smelled like stale coffee and wet pavement. Light slipped through the blinds in thin gray stripes, brushing across the untouched pie on the counter. My phone buzzed once, then went still again. The screen was littered with notifications from the family chat I still hadn't opened. I carried my mug to the balcony, the air damp and cold enough to sting my lungs. Seattle was quiet except for the low hiss of drizzle. I thought about how the same sky stretched over shoreline over the house where my family had eaten without me. Maybe the table was still messy with crumbs and laughter. Maybe they were pretending nothing was wrong. I took a sip of coffee that had already gone bitter and closed my eyes. That used to be my favorite sound, silverware clinking, chairs scraping, the hum of conversation. Now it felt like a ghost that wouldn't leave. Last Thanksgiving had been the last time I felt like I belonged anywhere. I could still see the candles flickering across Mom's china, smell the pumpkin spice that clung to everything. I'd made half the dishes myself, roasted squash cranberry sauce, the sweet rolls Dad loved. But when the compliments came, they drifted toward Caleb. "You picked a wonderful menu," Mom said, smiling at him like he'd planned it all. Caleb laughed, the kind of laugh that fills every corner of a room. He always had that gift, the spotlight followed him without effort. I remember watching him pour wine into Mom's glass, her hand resting proudly on his wrist. That was also the night Dad stood up to make a toast. "To family," he said, and his gaze went straight to Caleb. "And to our boy's big investment deal." Everyone clapped, even Aunt June, who usually rolled her eyes at Caleb's business talk. I'd just received a district award for teaching the highest reading improvement scores in my school, but no one mentioned it. I told myself it was fine. You don't correct your father's oversight in the middle of dinner. You smile, sip your wine, and tell your brother how proud you are of him. I'd learned that script by heart. After dessert, when everyone drifted into the living room, Mom caught me stacking plates. You don't have to clean, she said, but her tone made it clear that I should. Go sit with your brother. He hardly gets time with us. I wiped my hands on a towel and forced a smile. He's telling Dad about his next project, I said. I'll just make sure the dishes don't fossilize, she chuckled softly. Always so practical, Rachel. You get that from your father. It sounded like a compliment, but it landed like a verdict. Mom had perfected a kind of sweetness that cut. When I was little, she used to braid my hair while saying, "You're the steady one. Caleb's sensitive, so you'll have to be patient with him." When I'd cry because he'd broken my toys or taken the last cookie, she'd hush me. Don't be dramatic. He didn't mean it. Somehow his feelings were always delicate and mine were disposable. As we grew up, the pattern stayed. Caleb's mistakes were learning experiences. Mine were disappointments. Dad never contradicted her. He was a quiet man, all soft words and calloused hands that smelled faintly of pine sap. After that dinner last year, he drove me home, the heater blowing lukewarm air. We sat in silence until the wipers squeaked against the windshield. Finally, he said, "Your mother just wants peace, Rachel. You know how she gets when things are tense." I remember laughing low and tired. Peace isn't peace if only one person has it. He didn't respond. The next morning, he texted a heart emoji. That was his version of reconciliation. Now, standing in my kitchen a year later, the memory made my throat tighten. The photos on my wall looked foreign: Mom arranging flowers, Dad laughing at something off camera, Caleb holding his newborn twins. I should have taken them down months ago. Instead, I stared at them like evidence from a case I hadn't solved. I picked up one frame, the glass smudged with dust. In it, Caleb had his arm around me, both of us smiling at the camera. I tried to remember what that version of us felt like. Younger, hopeful, still pretending. I set the picture face down on the counter. The silence in the room was heavy enough to have weight. I opened my journal, the one I kept for lesson plans, but had turned into a confession book lately. I wrote slowly, my pen dragging across the paper. Every family has a golden child, and every golden child needs a scapegoat. The words looked too neat for how they felt. I stared at them until they blurred, then added one more line. Silence keeps the peace, but peace built on silence rots from the inside. The clock on the stove blinked 10:32. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the drizzle. The air smelled of cedar and wet leaves as I made my way toward Green Lake. Joggers in bright windbreakers splashed through puddles. A child tossed bread to ducks. Ordinary life went on, indifferent. I walked until the tightness in my chest eased a little. Sometimes, motion was the only thing that helped. When I was a kid, Mom used to bring us here on Sunday mornings. She'd feed the ducks while Dad read the newspaper on a bench. Caleb would climb trees and I'd be the one watching the time, making sure we didn't miss lunch. Such a little grown-up, she'd say. Back then, it felt like praise. Now, it sounded like a sentence. As I rounded the lake, I thought about Aunt June. She was Mom's younger sister, the family rebel. The one who drank whiskey instead of wine and told the truth without soft edges. Years ago, she'd pulled me aside during Christmas and said, "You know, sweetheart, your mom doesn't realize how much she leans on you. You're her safety net." I'd laughed then, thinking it was love. Now I knew safety nets don't get thanked, they just catch the fall. By the time I got home, the sky had darkened. My hair clung to my face, my jeans soaked at the ankles. I kicked off my shoes by the door and noticed the voicemail icon blinking on my phone. My stomach dipped when I saw the name Aunt June. The timestamp was from 10:17 the night before, right in the middle of their dinner. I pressed play. Her voice came through shaky but clear. "Rachel, it's me. Something happened at dinner. Don't answer their calls tonight. I'll explain soon. Just stay out of it for now." A clatter in the background, then her whisper, "You didn't go, did you?" The message ended with static. I stood there frozen, the hum of the fridge suddenly too loud. For a second, I wondered if it was some kind of prank. But Aunt June wasn't dramatic. If she sounded scared, there was a reason. I replayed the message, listening to every breath, every noise. In the distance, I thought I heard someone shouting before the line cut off. I checked the family chat again. Still 23 unread messages. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Whatever chaos had broken loose at that dinner, it wasn't my turn to clean it up. Not this time. I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The rain started again, tapping lightly on the window. For the first time, the sound didn't feel lonely, it felt like warning. I stared at my phone until the screen dimmed and whispered to the empty room. For once, it's not me who did something wrong. But I have a feeling I'll be the one who pays for it anyway. The rain hadn't stopped all night. By morning, it sounded like the whole city was exhaling through the gutters. I woke to the gray light, sneaking past the blinds, my head heavy, my throat dry from too much coffee and too little sleep. The voicemail from Aunt June kept replaying in my mind, her warning, the clatter, the fear. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. 46 unread messages. I didn't need to guess from who. The kitchen felt colder than it should have. I poured the last of the coffee into my mug and stared at the blinking notification. My thumb hovered, and then finally I opened the family chat. The first message was from Mom, time-stamped at 7:42 p.m. Last night. Something terrible happened. Call me. Then a flood of chaos. Caleb's wife typing in all caps, "Dad, call 911." Another from Aunt June, "I'm leaving. This is too much." Then photos. Blurry sideways, like someone had grabbed the phone mid-argument. A tablecloth soaked in wine. A broken glass on the floor. Someone's sleeve streaked red. Not blood, I told myself. Just Merlot. But the way the messages read, disjointed, panicked, it didn't sound like spilled wine. I scrolled faster. "Where's Rachel?" someone had typed. "She needs to know." The next message from Mom came minutes later. "Do not involve her." My breath caught. It was like watching a fire spread in slow motion. They'd been shouting about me. I hadn't even been there, and somehow I was part of the wreckage. My chest tightened. I typed "what happened" and hit send. The typing dots appeared, blinked, then disappeared. I waited another minute. Nothing. I tried calling Mom. Straight to voicemail. I tried Dad. The same. I called Caleb even though I knew he wouldn't answer. His voicemail message still had that smug cheerfulness. "Hey, it's Caleb. Leave a note, I'll circle back." I hung up before the beep. The apartment felt smaller with every unanswered ring. The sound of the rain filled the space between my thoughts. I leaned against the counter, trying to remember the last real conversation I'd had with any of them. It had been months. The fight about the business loan, maybe Mom telling me I didn't understand family sacrifice. She'd said it like I hadn't spent a decade cleaning up their messes. I swallowed hard. The same taste of resentment, metallic and familiar. Then the phone buzzed again. Aunt June calling. I snatched it up before the second ring. "June. What's going on?" Her voice was rough, like she'd been crying or yelling or both. "You didn't go last night, did you?" "No," I said. "What happened?" She hesitated. "I don't know everything, but it was bad, really bad. Start with what you do know." She exhaled long and shaky. "Dinner was normal at first. Tense but normal. Then this guy shows up, delivery man or so we thought. Says he has something for the Monroes straight from a law office. Lawson and Grant Associates." I froze. "A law office? Yeah." He hands Ellen a thick envelope, says he was told it was urgent. She opens it right there at the table. I could almost hear it as she spoke, the scrape of forks stopping the shift and breathing the hush before a storm. She goes pale. Dead silent. Everyone's staring at her. Then your brother asks what it is, and she snaps at him to sit down. Next thing I know, Caleb's shouting. Something about this isn't supposed to happen yet. My pulse quickened. Yep. Like he knew it was coming. I tried to calm them down, but then Ellen started crying. David stood up yelling about timing and the kids ran upstairs. It was chaos. Caleb slammed his glass down so hard it shattered. Wine everywhere. He kept saying your name, Rachel. He said, "She's not supposed to know." That's when I left. My hand trembled. I steadied it against the counter. Did anyone get hurt? No? Not physically anyway. She hesitated again. Look, honey, I don't know what that letter said, but it scared them. Whatever they've been hiding, it's big. The line went quiet for a moment except for her breathing. Then she said softly, "You need to be careful. They're terrified you'll find out." The words stuck in my chest. Find out what? That's what you have to figure out. We hung up, but her voice lingered. They're terrified you'll find out. I sat down at the table, phone still in my hand, and tried to piece it together. The family trust. The refinancing. The way Mom used to shoo me away whenever paperwork came up. You don't need to worry about these things, sweetheart. Let your brother handle it. She'd said that for years, and I'd believed her because believing her was easier than starting another war. Now I couldn't ignore it. I opened my laptop, fingers cold against the keyboard, and typed Lawson & Grant Associates Seattle into the search bar. The firm's website came up sterile, professional, exactly the kind of place Mom would choose to hide something behind. I scanned the staff list. A partner named Daniel Lawson, specializing in estate planning and family trusts. I'd heard that phrase before. Family trust. I dug into my email history, searching for the name. There it was, buried in the archives from 3 years ago, a forwarded message I wasn't supposed to see. The subject line read, "Transfer confirmation, Monroe Trust adjustments." The body was short, "All documents signed and filed. Next steps, notify beneficiary upon final review." Beneath it, a note from Mom, "Please delete this chain. Rachel doesn't need to be involved." My stomach twisted. I'd deleted it back then without thinking. Now I wanted to scream at my past self. I opened the firm's contact page and dialed the main number. "Lawson & Grant, this is Kendra." A polished voice answered. "Hi," I said, trying to steady my tone. "My name's Rachel Monroe. I think my family has an account, or trust, managed by your office. I need to know what's going on." "I'm afraid I can't discuss client information over the phone," she said pleasantly. "But you're welcome to make an appointment." "When's the earliest?" "Monday morning at 9, she replied. "Fine. Schedule it." She confirmed, took my number, and wished me a good day, like I hadn't just asked her to unearth a family secret. When I hung up, the quiet came back heavy and thick. I stared out the window where the rain blurred the skyline into streaks of silver. My reflection looked older, harder. For years, I'd thought silence was the way to survive my family, that by staying out of their fights, I could stay intact. But silence wasn't safety. It was just another way to disappear. I grabbed a notebook from the drawer and started writing everything I knew: the dinner, the envelope, the law firm, the old email. I underlined one line until the paper nearly tore. They didn't forget me. They erased me on purpose. Outside, thunder rolled across the sound, slow and deliberate. I looked at my phone again, still no call from Mom. No apology, no explanation. Just a string of panicked messages that didn't include me. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of rain fill the room. The version of me who would have chased after them, demanded answers, begged for understanding, that woman was gone. What was left was quieter but sharper, like glass cooled from fire. I picked up my pen again and wrote the final note for the night. For years, silence kept me safe. Now it's the only thing they're afraid of. Then I set the notebook aside and listened to the rain beat against the glass, steady and relentless, as if the city itself was trying to warn me that peace was about to break. Sunday morning came wrapped in fog. The kind of fog that made Seattle look like a half-forgotten photograph, muted gray, and just a little unreal. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Aunt June's voice again. "They're terrified. You'll find out." Those words had settled under my skin, an ache that caffeine couldn't chase away. I stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the street below blur in the drizzle. Somewhere out there, my parents were probably doing what they did best, pretending. Pretending nothing happened, pretending I didn't exist. Tomorrow I'd meet with the lawyers at Lawson and Grant. The thought made my stomach tighten. What if I was wrong? What if I was just inventing ghosts to fill the silence they'd left behind? Still, the feeling wouldn't leave. Something in that dinner had cracked open, and somehow I was standing right in the fracture. Around 10, a knock echoed through my apartment. Sharp, hurried. I set down my mug, half expecting Aunt June or maybe even Mom, though the rational part of me knew better. When I opened the door, a delivery driver stood there, raindrops beating on his jacket. "Package for Ellen Monroe," he said, reading from his tablet. I blinked. "She doesn't live here." He frowned, glancing at the label. "Address matches East Pine Unit 5B. "That's me," I said slowly. "But Ellen's my mother." He shrugged, holding out the small square box. "Must have been sent by mistake." "Same address, right? Just sign here." I hesitated, then scribbled my name. The box was heavier than it looked, wrapped neatly in brown paper with a printed return label, Monroe Floral Co., Lake City Branch. My chest tightened. That shop had closed 2 years ago after Mom's so-called retirement. I hadn't seen its name since. The paper smelled faintly of dust and lavender, the same scent that used to cling to Mom's sweaters after long days at the store. I set the box on the counter, staring at it like it might move. Part of me thought about leaving it sealed, walking away, pretending it wasn't there. But curiosity has a way of ignoring reason. I peeled off the tape. Inside, nestled in yellowed newspaper, was a ceramic vase, cream-colored, etched with vines. My breath caught. I knew this vase. It had sat on the counter of Monroe Floral for as long as I could remember. Mom used to tell me it was too special to sell. I hadn't thought about it in years. As I lifted it out, something shifted beneath the wrapping, a small envelope taped to the bottom of the box. The handwriting on it made my skin prickle. Records, Monroe Trust. The letters were shaky but unmistakable. My father's handwriting. I sat down hard at the kitchen table, staring at it. The room felt smaller, the air too thick. My hands shook as I tore the envelope open. Inside were 3 folded sheets of paper, photocopies of bank transfers each, with my name listed as the sender. I scanned the lines, my pulse quickening. Monthly payments, loan repayment, household support. The recipient was the Monroe Family Trust. The amounts matched the exact figures I'd sent Mom over the last few years, helping them out. There was a 4th page, handwritten, just a few words in Dad's script. "Keep this safe. Don't let Caleb or Ellen see. D.M." My chest ached. I pressed my thumb over the initials as if I could feel him there. The last time I'd spoken to him, his voice had sounded tired but kind. "You know your mother, Rachel. She just wants peace." I realize now that peace had been his apology for surrender. I went back to the vase, tracing the pattern along its rim. A faint crack ran through one side, sealed over with some kind of glue. I turned it, remembering how Mom once sat in the shop late at night fixing that same crack, muttering to herself. "Some things belong where they can't be found," she'd said when I asked what she meant. At the time, I thought she was talking about flowers out of season. Now I wasn't so sure. I flipped through the papers again. The bank transfers came from my own checking account, automated payments I'd set up for what I thought were family expenses, utilities, medical bills, repairs. Every one of those transactions had been rerouted into the trust. My money, their cover. A wave of heat rose up my neck. Betrayal has a strange sound, like nothing and everything all at once. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes. For years I'd believed I was helping them survive. Turns out I'd been funding their lies. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the view. I turned on the lamp, its yellow light catching on the vase's glaze. It gleamed faintly like an unblinking eye. For a moment I imagined the shop again, the rows of tulips, the bell over the door, Mom's hands arranging bouquets, while Dad handled invoices in the back room. That place had smelled like soil and secrets. I reached for the vase and set it in the center of my table. Water from my fingertips left smudges on the ceramic. The silence in the apartment deepened, pressing in around me. I whispered, "What were you trying to tell me, Dad?" No answer, of course. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint drip of rain from the balcony. Still, something about the timing of the delivery felt deliberate, like the past had found a way to mail itself forward. I searched the box again and found a small card wedged between layers of newspaper. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was careful, feminine. "To my daughter one day, you'll understand the meaning of silence." No name, no date. My throat tightened. Was it from Mom? Or someone else entirely? I took photos of every document, uploading them to a private drive, then emailed copies to myself just in case. Old habits die hard, and I wasn't about to let these disappear. When I was done, I sat back and looked around the room, the half-empty coffee mug, the rain-specked window, the vase, like a witness in the middle of it all. The quiet was interrupted by a low buzz. My phone lit up on the counter, private number. My heart jumped. I almost let it go to voicemail, but instinct overruled hesitation. I picked up. "Hello." There was a pause, just breathing, then a man's voice, hoarse, trembling. "Rachel, it's your dad." I froze. "Dad, where are you? What's going on?" "Listen to me," he said, words ragged. "Don't go to the lawyer tomorrow. Promise me." "What? Why? They'll twist it." "They'll." He stopped, coughing hard. "Just don't, please, Dad, what are you talking about?" "Who's they?" Static crackled on the line, swallowing the rest of his words. Then nothing. The call ended. I stood there for a long time, phone still against my ear, the dial tone humming like a heartbeat. Outside, the fog was thick enough to hide everything. Inside, the only sound was my own breath, uneven and loud. I looked at the papers again, the ink slightly smudged from where I'd touched them. My father's warning echoed in my mind. For years, they'd told me silence was protection. But now I knew better. Silence wasn't protection, it was the perfect cover for a crime. The dial tone hummed in my ear long after the call ended. I kept whispering Dad even though I knew he couldn't hear me. When the line finally went dead, the silence that followed was almost physical. I stared at the phone, trying to call him back. The number flashed private caller and disappeared before I could hit redial. My hands were shaking. I replayed the voicemail history, but there was nothing new. Then I opened my recordings folder. My phone automatically saved incoming calls. The playback crackled with static. His voice sounded even weaker than I remembered. "Rachel," he'd said, gasping between words, "don't go to the lawyer tomorrow. Promise me." Then came a loud bang like a door hitting something hard, followed by a faint metallic sound, tools falling. Maybe I replayed it again, volume all the way up. The same noises, the same cutoff. I dialed Aunt June, no answer. Again, still nothing. By the third attempt, I started pacing. The apartment felt too quiet, too aware. I caught my reflection in the window hair, messy eyes, wide shoulders tense like I'd been holding my breath all night. For the first time since this started, I felt scared. Not the kind of scared that keeps you up, it was colder, deeper, like someone had already taken something from me and I didn't even know what. I tried searching the local news on my laptop: traffic accidents, hospital admissions, emergency calls. Nothing about my father. Nothing about the Monroes. Maybe he was fine. Maybe it was just a bad connection. Maybe I was spiraling. But my gut said otherwise. My gut whispered that someone didn't want him talking to me. By midnight, the rain had turned into a downpour. I sat at the kitchen table with the vase in front of me, the documents spread out like puzzle pieces. The ink from his handwriting had smudged slightly where I'd touched it earlier. I traced each letter of his initials. D.M. The smell of wet ceramic and lavender filled the room, mixing with the metallic scent of rain seeping through the open window. I remembered him once years ago, bent over the family computer fixing a virus I'd accidentally installed. I'd been 15, standing behind him as he typed. "Don't trust anything that hides behind silence," he said, without looking up. "If something doesn't want to be seen, there's a reason." I'd laughed it off then. Now the memory hit like prophecy. At 5 in the morning, my phone rang. I lunged for it so fast I nearly knocked over the coffee mug. The caller ID read Aunt June. I answered before the first ring finished. "June, what happened? Have you heard from Dad?" Her voice came through, cracked and tired. "Rachel, listen to me. Don't panic. Tell me, it's your father. He's in the hospital." The world tilted. "What? When last night?" "Around 10. They found him collapsed in the garage. Caleb said it looked like a heart attack, but the doctors aren't sure. He's stable but unconscious." I grabbed my keys off the counter. "What hospital?" "Swedish First Hill." But wait, I was already pulling on my jacket. "I'm going, Rachel," she said sharply. "There's something else you need to know first." I stopped, hand on the door. "What now? I went to see your mother this morning." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She's lying about what happened." I froze. "What do you mean?" She told the paramedics she found him right away. But their neighbor said he'd been in that garage for hours before anyone called. The lights were still on, the car door open. It doesn't make sense. My throat went dry. "You think they waited? I think they were arguing," she said. "And I think whatever he was trying to tell you last night had something to do with that letter that showed up on Thanksgiving." I swallowed hard. "You saw the envelope. I saw one of them. But there was another one your mother tried to hide. It came after the delivery man left. I didn't get to read it, but I saw the name on it. Lawson and Grant. The law firm again." "Of course." "June," I said slowly, "I found papers. In a box sent from Mom's old shop. Dad's handwriting. Transfers, trust documents. He was warning me." Silence stretched over the line. Then she whispered, "Oh my God. I think he knew they were changing something. Maybe the trust, maybe the will." June exhaled shakily. "Rachel, your grandfather's will, the original one, it left the house and the shop to your father and after him to you. Caleb wasn't supposed to get any of it." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that a few years ago, after your father's health scare, your mother told everyone the will was destroyed. She said your grandfather's lawyer misplaced it, but I remember her bragging about a new arrangement. I thought it was harmless until last week when your dad came by. He looked awful paranoid almost. He told me, 'If something happens to me, tell Rachel to check the lawyer's files.' Then he left." I sank into a chair. "He said the same name, yes. Lawson and Grant. That's who's been managing the family trust since your grandfather passed. Your mother insisted on it." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, the kind that wasn't quite tears. "So they erased me from it. My own family." "Rachel, no," I said, voice sharper than I meant. "It all fits. The secret dinner, the panic, the way they kept me out. They wanted to finalize the new documents before I found out. That's why Dad called. He was trying to stop it." June didn't argue. Her silence said enough. I stood already, grabbing my keys again. "I'm going to the hospital." "Wait," she said. "They'll be there. Ellen and Caleb. Are you sure you want to walk into that? I have to see him?" The drive through downtown felt endless. Rain streaked across the windshield like veins of light. My wipers thudded in rhythm with my heartbeat. By the time I pulled into the hospital parking lot, dawn had turned the clouds a dull pale silver. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and coffee hit me like a wave. I found the ICU ward, the nurse pointing silently toward room 214. I could see him through the glass, Dad lying so still, machines blinking beside him. He looked smaller than I remembered, the kind of small that comes with surrender. I placed my palm against the cold glass. "I'm here," I whispered, though he couldn't hear. "I'll figure this out. I promise." Behind me, footsteps echoed. I turned. Aunt June stood at the end of the hall, her coat damp hair frizzed from the rain. She gave me a small, weary nod. "I told you I'd meet you here," she said softly. We sat together in the waiting area, the hum of vending machines filling the silence. June clasped her hands, staring straight ahead. If the will's been rewritten, you'll need proof to challenge it. The law firm will have records, dates, signatures. If your name was removed, it'll show there. I nodded. I have to see what's inside their files. She looked at me, worry etched deep around her mouth. You're sure about this? Once you start, you can't take it back. I met her eyes. They already took enough from me. I'm done being quiet. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm outside die down. The air smelled like rain and disinfectant and something bittersweet I couldn't name. When I finally left the hospital, the city had begun to wake. Traffic lights blinked red against puddles. I drove home with the heater on full blast, hands tight on the wheel. The last of the fog clung to the streets like smoke. As I pulled into my driveway, something pale caught my eye on the doormat, a large envelope sealed in clear plastic to protect it from the rain. My stomach dropped before I even stepped out of the car. I crouched to pick it up. Across the front, printed in bold black letters, were the words Lawson and Grant, urgent trust revision documents. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. I looked up at the gray sky, the air sharp against my skin. For years they'd told me silence was protection. Now I knew better. If silence hid their crime, then truth would be my revenge. The envelope was soaked through by the time I picked it up. Rainwater had blurred the black print across the front, but I could still make out the words that made my pulse spike. Lawson and Grant. Urgent trust revision documents. I stood on the porch, the sound of water dripping from the eaves like a clock counting down. My first instinct was to drop it, pretend I hadn't seen it. Pretend my life hadn't already started unraveling piece by piece. But pretending had cost me enough already. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table beside the vase. Two worlds side by side, the one my mother built and the one my father tried to save me from. The paper left damp rings on the wood. I tore it open carefully, the smell of wet ink rising up like something alive. The first page was stamped, Trust Revision Agreement. My name was printed at the top, in formal block letters, Rachel Monroe. The kind of type that doesn't belong to real people. My eyes moved down the page until they stopped on a sentence that made my stomach twist. Effective beneficiary Caleb Monroe. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. I turned the next page. Property allocation. The family house. The old flower shop. The retirement accounts. Every single asset listed under my brother's name. At the bottom, there was a signature line for me, except it wasn't mine. My name scrawled in an imitation of my handwriting, shakier, slanted wrong. And below it, the witness signature, Ellen Monroe. My mother. My hands trembled so hard I had to set the papers down. There was a note stapled to the last page from the law office: revision completed per client request. All prior versions superseded. The date was 3 weeks ago. I stared at that sentence until the words started to blur. I could almost hear Mom's voice saying it, calm and satisfied. It's just paperwork, honey. You worry too much. Something else slipped out of the envelope, a smaller, older letter folded in thirds. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink faded to brown. My name was written across the front in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was a child. To my granddaughter, Rachel. I knew that script instantly. My grandfather's. My throat tightened as I unfolded it. My dearest Rachel, it began. If you are reading this, I am gone. I want you to know I left something behind for you, not just money but the truth of what is yours. You have your grandmother's steadiness. You earn everything you touch. That's why I left you the foundation of this family. The shop, the land, the trust. Not because you asked, but because you never did. Ellen and Caleb chase what glitters, but you, my girl, you see what lasts. My eyes stung. I read the last paragraph twice to be sure. If one day they tell you there's nothing left for you, don't believe it. The truth always leaves a trace. I folded the letter back up with shaking fingers. He'd seen it coming, even then, my mother's greed. My brother's entitlement. and me the quiet one, the convenient scapegoat. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel crazy. I felt furious. Dad had known. He must have found out what they did, how they'd changed the trust, rewritten the will, forged my name. Maybe that's what he'd tried to tell me before he collapsed. Don't go to the lawyer, he'd said. He wasn't protecting them. He was protecting me. He must have known how dangerous the truth would be once it surfaced. But the damage was already done. I looked back at the documents. My fake signature stared up at me like an accusation. Mom's name below it gleamed faintly where the ink had bled. She hadn't just lied. She'd erased me from my own family on paper. The rain outside grew heavier, hammering against the windows in a steady rhythm. I gathered the papers and spread them out on the counter, matching each date and reference number to the copies Dad had hidden in the vase. They aligned almost perfectly, except for one detail: his record stopped 2 months ago. The revisions had happened after that, after he tried to fix it. I sat down, my head in my hands. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Dad?" I whispered. But maybe he had tried and Mom had silenced him like she'd silenced everyone else. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number from the letterhead, Lawson and Grant. The receptionist answered, her voice crisp and polite. "Good evening, Lawson and Grant Legal Associates. This is Rachel Monroe," I said quickly. "I need to speak to Daniel Lawson. It's about my family's trust." There was a pause. "Mr. Lawson isn't available right now," she said. "But he did leave a message in case you called." My heart pounded. "A message for me?" "Yes, ma'am." I heard the faint shuffle of papers. He said, and I quote, "If Miss Monroe contacts the office, tell her not to trust anyone from her family until she sees the original record." I gripped the phone tighter. "What record?" "I'm afraid he didn't specify," she said. "He just said you'd understand." The line crackled, then went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. Original record. That meant there was still a copy of the real will somewhere, one they hadn't destroyed. And Lawson knew it. Maybe that's why Dad warned me not to go in person. Maybe someone had already tried to keep him quiet. I gathered the papers and slid them into a folder. My reflection in the window looked different now. My face harder, older. The kind of expression you get when you've run out of ways to pretend things are fine. The vase on the table caught the lamplight, its surface gleaming like bone. Next to it I laid the letter from my grandfather, smoothing out the creases. The truth always leaves a trace. I traced the sentence with my fingertip until it felt carved into me. Dad's voice echoed faintly in my head. From that night in the garage, his last words before the line cut out. "Promise me." I exhaled slowly. "I promise," I whispered. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, low and distant. I gathered every document, every photograph, every letter into a single envelope and slipped it into my bag. My hands stopped shaking. They thought they'd buried the truth under signatures and silence. But they forgot who I was, the daughter who never stopped cleaning up after them, who noticed every detail they ignored. I turned off the lights, leaving only the lamp glowing over the table. The letter and the vase sat side by side, two ghosts of the same story. "They built their peace on lies," I said quietly to the empty room. "Tomorrow I'll make sure the truth tears it apart." Morning light crept through the blinds, thin and metallic. I hadn't slept. The folder sat on my kitchen table, its edges damp from where I'd held it too long. Every document inside felt like a loaded weapon, proof of everything they'd done, every lie they'd told. I poured coffee, but it tasted like metal too. Outside, the sky over Seattle was washed pale, the kind of gray that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. By 8, I was in my car. The folder sat on the passenger seat like a passenger who wouldn't stop staring. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, even though I'd made that trip 1,000 times before. Each block felt like a countdown I couldn't stop. When I turned onto Lakeview, my stomach twisted. The house looked smaller somehow, windows closed, shutters drawn. The rose bushes Mom used to obsess over were brown and brittle. Caleb's silver SUV sat in the driveway. I parked at the curb. Before I could knock, the front door opened. Mom stood there, arms folded, wearing a cashmere sweater that matched her voice when she said, "Rachel." "What are you doing here, morning, Mom?" I said. "We need to talk." Her eyes flicked to the folder in my hands, then back to my face. "Now's not a good time." "It's the perfect time," I said, pushing past her into the hallway. The air inside smelled faintly of bleach and something floral, like she'd tried to cover up the scent of panic. The kitchen looked the same except colder. The family photos were still on the wall. Caleb in his cap and gown, Caleb at the company launch party, Mom and Dad cutting a cake. No pictures of me after college. I set the folder down on the counter. "You forged my name," I said. Her back stiffened. "Excuse me, on the trust papers. You signed for me and you witnessed it. It's not even a good forgery." For a second she just stared. Then her voice softened the way it always did before she said something cruel. "Rachel, you're upset. This is all a misunderstanding." I laughed, once sharp and humorless. "A misunderstanding doesn't get notarized." Footsteps sounded behind us. Caleb walked in barefoot, holding a coffee mug like it was a prop. "So this is the reunion," he said. "Didn't think you'd show up this soon." "Funny, I said I didn't think thieves made house calls either," he smirked. "You never cared about any of this, Rachel. The house, the trust, the business, it was all Dad's world. You wanted out, remember? So you got out." "Yeah," I said. "And you used that to take everything else." Mom moved between us like a referee. "Enough. We're not doing this here." I slid the papers out of the folder and laid them on the counter. "We're doing it right here." Caleb glanced at the pages, his smirk fading. "Where'd you get these?" "Where do you think they were mailed to me?" "Maybe Dad's last act of conscience." Mom shook her head. "He was confused, Rachel. You know how he gets." My voice went flat. "He's in a coma, Mom. That's not confusion, that's consequence." Her face crumpled for a second, then hardened again. "Everything we did was to keep this family together. To protect what's ours." "What's yours?" I said. "You mean what used to be mine?" Caleb leaned on the counter, pretending to stay calm. "You always think everyone's out to get you. You weren't cut out for this, Rachel. Dad knew it. That's why he left me in charge. He didn't leave you anything," I said, sliding the forged signature page toward him. "You stole it, and you let Mom help you." His jaw flexed. "You're lying." I pointed at the line with my fake signature. "That's not my handwriting." Mom stepped closer, her voice trembling now. "Maybe the lawyer made a mistake. You know these firms, they rush things." "Funny," I said, "how their mistakes always land in your favor." Her mouth opened, then closed. I pulled out the letter from Grandpa and laid it next to the papers. The edges trembled in my hands, but my voice didn't. "You remember this?" I asked. Mom frowned. "Where did you get that?" "From the file you thought you destroyed. He left everything to Dad, and me, not you and Caleb. You changed it after he died." "I have his words right here. If they tell you there's nothing left for you, don't believe it." Caleb grabbed the letter, ripping it in half before I could stop him. "You're pathetic," he hissed, digging through dead people's garbage for attention. I didn't move. "Doesn't matter," I said quietly. I already scanned it. For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking above the sink. Then Mom whispered, "You don't understand the pressure we were under. After your father's last heart scare, the loans, the house, Caleb saved us. You should be grateful." "Grateful," I said, laughing. For being erased, her eyes filled with tears, but they looked rehearsed like everything else about her. "You've always been so dramatic." Caleb slammed his mug down, coffee splattering across the counter. "You know what this is really about, jealousy. You couldn't stand that Dad trusted me with the business. You were always the problem, Rachel. Always the disappointment." My voice came out calm, colder than I expected. "If disappointment means I didn't lie, steal, or forge signatures, then I'll take it," Mom shouted. "Enough," her voice cracked. "You think this is easy. You think I wanted this. You wanted control," I said. "You've had it your whole life. But it ends now." Her hands trembled as she reached for the papers, but I was faster. I gathered them up and slid them back into the folder. You didn't just betray me, I said. You betrayed Dad. Something flickered in her eyes, guilt maybe, or fear. Don't you dare turn him against me. I looked straight at her. You did that all by yourself. Caleb shoved a hand through his hair, pacing. You can't prove anything, he muttered. I tilted my head. You sure about that? I reached into the folder and pulled out a smaller envelope that had fallen loose earlier. The handwriting on the front stopped them both cold. From D. Lawson. Mom's face drained of color. Where did you get that? I opened it, sliding out a single page. It's a copy of Dad's transfer authorization. It says he named you temporary trustee under duress. And there's a note from the lawyer. Original will still archived. Only one person has access. Guess who that is? Caleb stared at me, eyes narrowing. You wouldn't. I smiled, small and certain. Watch me. Mom sank into the nearest chair, her breath shaking. Caleb cursed under his breath and stormed out the back door, the slam echoing through the house. The sound made something inside me unclench. For the first time, I wasn't the one backing away. I picked up the folder, turned toward Mom. She looked smaller now, her hands gripping the edge of the table like she was holding on to the last piece of her version of the world. Next time we talk, I said, it'll be in court. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I walked to the front door, pausing only once to glance back at the house. The walls seemed to hum with all the lies they'd absorbed. Outside, the rain had stopped. A police cruiser rolled slowly past the end of the street, its lights flashing against the wet pavement. The reflection rippled across the windows like a warning. I tightened my grip on the folder. They'd built their lies in that house, brick by brick. Now I had the map to burn it down. Downtown Seattle looked colder than usual that morning. The air was sharp, metallic, the kind that burned when you breathed too deep. I parked outside the Lawson and Grant building and sat for a minute watching people rush past with umbrellas and coffee cups, all of them living ordinary lives that didn't collapse overnight. I grabbed the folder from the passenger seat, tucked it under my arm, and walked in. The lobby smelled like rain and paper. Glass walls, black marble floors, silence heavy enough to make you self-conscious. A receptionist with perfectly slicked hair smiled, just enough to look human. Miss Monroe, she asked. I nodded. Mr. Lawson's expecting me. She gestured toward the elevators. 12th floor. When the doors opened, Daniel Lawson was already standing at the end of the hallway. Tall, mid-50s gray suit, the kind of presence that made you straighten your spine. His eyes flicked to the folder in my hands. You shouldn't have come alone, he said quietly. I've been alone for a long time, I said. Might as well finish what I started. He gave a slow nod and led me into his office, a wall of windows overlooking the sound shelves of case binders, and a single framed photo of a younger man shaking hands with someone I assumed was a client. Sit, he said, motioning toward the chair. I laid the folder on the desk and started pulling things out, the forged trust papers, the letter from my grandfather, the note from my father, and the envelope marked from D. Lawson. He studied them carefully, his expression tightening as he compared signatures. You said your father warned you not to come here, right before he collapsed. Lawson opened his laptop and began typing. The screen filled with document logs, timestamps, and scanned signatures. The original Monroe Family Trust is still in our archives, he said, marked restricted access. Do you know what that means? It means someone locked it. He nodded. Only the person who created the trust or the executor can open it. Your father never gave anyone power of attorney, which means someone else tried to override it. Ellen and Caleb. I didn't ask. I knew. Lawson scrolled further. 3 months ago they came in together. They brought what looked like an emergency authorization. Said your father wanted the trust revised. They insisted on using a notary they provided. My stomach turned. And you believed them? I didn't? He said. Your father called me a few weeks before that. He told me if anything happened, not to finalize changes without his daughter's consent. So why didn't you stop them? He sighed. They submitted a medical certificate claiming he was unfit to handle his affairs. and they attached an order signed by another attorney, one I'd never met. Before I could verify, Ellen sent a letter freezing access. He turned the screen toward me. There it was. Monroe Trust, transfer under duress. The words felt like glass in my throat. Can you show me? I asked. Lawson hesitated, then stood and crossed the room to a locked cabinet. He pulled out a small silver USB drive labeled Monroe Revision, raw footage. What's that? Every signing is recorded for compliance, he said. I wasn't there that day, but my associate was. You should see this. He plugged it in. The video opened with the date stamped in the corner 3 months ago. My father sat in a wheelchair, pale, trembling, a hospital blanket over his lap. A clipboard rested on his knees. My mother stood beside him in a navy coat, her voice low but firm. Just sign it, darling. It's what we discussed. Caleb appeared behind him, one hand gripping the back of the chair. Come on, Dad, it's just paperwork. Dad looked confused, eyes darting toward the camera. I thought Rachel Mom cut in. Rachel agreed. Don't worry about her right now. His hand shook as he reached for the pen. Caleb leaned forward, steadying his wrist, pressing it down onto the paper. My stomach lurched. Stop it, I whispered. Lawson paused the video. This was filed as voluntary. Voluntary, I laughed, a short, broken sound. He could barely lift the pen. Lawson's face was grim. With this, you can open a criminal case, fraud, coercion, elder abuse. But it's going to get ugly. I leaned back, my hands trembling on my knees. I saw Dad's face again, how tired he looked that last time we spoke, how he'd said, "You'll have to be the strong one someday." I hadn't understood. Not until now. Lawson slid the drive toward me. You'll need a copy. I took it, closing my fingers around the metal. It felt heavier than it should have. What happens if I file? They'll fight, he said simply. They'll hire new counsel, spin the story, tell the press you're... 3 days after meeting Daniel, the news broke. It started with one small headline buried on a local site: Architect accuses family of fraud in Monroe Trust case. Within hours it was everywhere. My inbox filled faster than I could delete. Is this you? One coworker texted. You okay? Another asked. Someone else wrote, wow, Rachel family drama much. I turned off my phone, but it kept buzzing on the table like a trapped insect. I made coffee I couldn't drink and stared at the wall. My own name on the screen felt unreal. Monroe, a name I'd once worn like a burden, now twisted into a headline. By afternoon, I gave in and scrolled through the comments. She's greedy. How could she do that to her mother? Some people will do anything for money. My stomach tightened, but what hurt most wasn't strangers. It was the people I knew, the silence from those who should have known better. Then came the message from Mom. Long paragraphs, half accusation, half plea. You've destroyed us. Take it back before it's too late. Your father wouldn't want this. You're tearing the family apart. I laughed, a dry sound that hurt my throat. The family had been torn apart long before this, just nobody wanted to look at the wreckage. Not long after Caleb made his move, he posted a statement online, a slick paragraph that sounded rehearsed. Our sister has been struggling emotionally for years. This lawsuit breaks our hearts. We hope she finds peace. The comments poured in, heart emojis, messages of sympathy, people calling him brave. I stared at the screen, jaw clenched, wondering if anyone saw how perfectly he'd learned from her. Lai's smile sounds sincere. By evening, I decided to stay quiet. They wanted a war of words. I wanted something better, proof. The next morning, I woke to a single anonymous email. The subject line read, "You think you've won? Check your father's chart." The words hit me like cold water. I grabbed my keys and drove to Swedish First Hill. The hospital smelled the same: disinfectant, coffee, tired hope. My father looked unchanged through the glass, still sleeping beneath the soft pulse of monitors. A nurse led me to the attending physician, a young man with circles under his eyes. I need to see his medical chart, I said. I'm his daughter. He hesitated, glancing at the computer. It shows Mrs. Ellen Monroe as primary medical proxy. She approved the privacy lockout. I blinked. What lockout? It means no one else can access or make medical decisions without her permission. My pulse spiked. Even if I'm his daughter, he nodded slowly. If she's listed as next of kin, legally. Yes. I swallowed hard, my voice shaking. Can she? Can she decide to end care? He didn't answer directly, but his silence was enough. I stepped out into the hallway, the walls closing in. I called Daniel from beside the vending machine. She changed his proxy, I said. If something happens, she can pull the plug. He didn't hesitate. I'll file an emergency motion. Sit tight, don't confront her yet. We'll stop her before she tries anything. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the metal of the vending machine. Pale skin, tired eyes, jaw set. I barely recognized the woman looking back. While waiting for Daniel's call, I sat in the hospital lobby and drifted into old memories. The Sunday mornings, when Dad would make pancakes too thick. Mom complaining they weren't picture perfect. He'd wink at me and say, "Your mom likes things neat, but real life's messy." I used to think it was funny. Now it sounded like a warning. By the time I got home, it was dark. My apartment felt different, the air too still. I dropped my purse on the counter and froze. The folder that had been on my table was gone. The drawers were open, files scattered. My laptop sat on the couch, the screen still glowing. My breath caught. The USB Daniel's copy of the video was missing. I ran to the door, checking the lock. It wasn't broken, just slightly misaligned. Whoever came in had a key. I called 911, reported the break-in, but when the officers arrived, their faces said what their words didn't. Nothing else stolen, one asked. So, it's personal, I nodded. Extremely. They took notes, promised to file a report, then left. The apartment felt emptier after they were gone. I called Daniel again. They got the drive, I said. Backup's safe, he replied. But you need to leave that place. Tonight. An hour later, I checked into a small hotel by the river. No name, just the Riverside Inn in fading paint. The room smelled faintly of damp carpet and lavender cleaner. I drew the curtains and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled hum of traffic. For the first time, I realized how deeply silence could cut. It wasn't peace anymore. It was isolation. Near midnight, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number, I answered, voice steady. Who is this? A man spoke softly, almost whispering. You need to stop. They'll bury the case if you don't. Who's this? Think about your father, he said, and the line went dead. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, breathing hard. The voice was familiar. One of Caleb's old friends, someone who used to fix things for the family. They thought fear would work. They didn't understand fear was the only language I'd learned from them, and I was fluent now. The next morning, I packed what little I'd brought and went downstairs for coffee. The sky outside was a dull, flat gray, but the river shimmered beneath it, restless and alive. My phone buzzed with a new message from Daniel. Emergency motion accepted. Temporary restraining order granted. Your mother can't touch your father's care. I read it 3 times before it sank in. My hands started shaking. Then I laughed, quiet and broken. I walked outside, the cold air biting my cheeks, and for the first time in weeks I breathed without pain. The wind off the water smelled like rain and iron and something clean. I looked toward the skyline where the hospital stood small and far away. Somewhere in that building, my father was still breathing because I'd refused to stop. The phone buzzed again, another message from an unknown number. This isn't over, I smiled faintly. You're right, I said to the empty air. For the first time, the storm wasn't outside, it was theirs. The morning of the hearing was so clear it felt wrong. No rain, no fog, just cold sunlight bouncing off downtown glass. Seattle never looked this clean, not even on good days. I stood outside the courthouse with Daniel holding the folder like it was armor. My stomach had been in knots since dawn. He glanced at me as we passed through the security line. Stay calm, he said quietly. They'll try to get under your skin. I gave a dry laugh. They've been doing that my whole life. The courtroom smelled like paper and polished wood. My mother was already there, sitting at the defense table in a pale blue suit, her hair perfect, face powdered just enough to look fragile. Caleb sat beside her, scrolling on his phone until he noticed me. His smirk barely lasted a second. I took my seat next to Daniel, facing them. The silence between us felt electric. When Mom finally looked at me, her eyes were cool, calculating, not maternal. It was the same look she used when appraising flowers for a funeral arrangement, clinical, distant. Reporters lingered in the back rows, whispering, pens ready. A headline waiting to happen, family tears itself, apart in court. Carmichael, their lawyer, approached us with a fake smile. "Miss Monroe," he said, extending a hand. "Still sure you want to do this?" I looked at his hand, then back at his face. More than ever. He smirked, turned, and walked back to their table. When the bailiff called the session to order, my pulse quickened. The judge, Honorable Meredith Blake, sat tall behind the bench. Silver hair pulled back, expression unreadable. Case number 2, 4C1073. Monroe versus Monroe, the clerk announced. Hearing my name against theirs felt strange. Like being introduced to ghosts who still breathed. Carmichael went first. "Your Honor," he began, voice dripping sympathy. "This is a tragic misunderstanding within a grieving family. No crime, no malice, just pain. My client only wishes for reconciliation." Daniel stood unhurried. "Your Honor, this case isn't about grief. It's about fraud, about a daughter erased from her own family by signatures she didn't write and lies she didn't tell." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Blake raised a hand for silence. "Proceed with evidence." Daniel gestured to the screen behind us. "Exhibit A." The video started. My father appeared on the screen, sitting at a long mahogany table, face pale, eyes dull. His hand trembled as he held a pen. My mother's voice off camera said softly, "Just sign it, darling. It's what we discussed." He hesitated. Caleb leaned forward, placing a hand on his wrist, pressing down. The pen scraped across the paper. Someone gasped in the courtroom. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out the sound. Daniel's voice was calm. "This footage was recorded at Lawson & Grant for legal compliance. The file's metadata confirms authenticity." Carmichael shot up. "Objection, the video is incomplete. Context matters." "Context," Daniel repeated. "A dying man forced to sign away his estate under duress. That's all the context this court needs." The judge leaned forward. "Objection overruled. Continue." On screen, my mother reached out to pat my father's shoulder, smiling faintly. "You're doing the right thing," she whispered. I couldn't look away. For months I'd imagined how it might have happened, but imagination had nothing on the sound of that pen dragging across the paper. When the video ended, silence filled the room like smoke. Judge Blake cleared her throat. "Noted for the record." Daniel turned toward me. "Miss Monroe, please take the stand." My legs felt heavy as I stood. The oath sounded distant as I swore to tell the truth. Daniel's questions came steady, deliberate. "Why did you bring this case forward?" I looked at the judge, then at my mother. "Because silence became survival. I wanted to see what happens when you finally break it." Daniel nodded. "Did you intend to destroy your family?" I shook my head. "No, they did that themselves." Carmichael rose for cross-examination, his smile back in place. "Miss Monroe, you've accused your mother and brother of serious crimes. You're angry, aren't you?" "I'm human," I said. "Angry enough to want revenge?" I met his eyes. "No, I want accountability. There's a difference." He hesitated, then turned away, muttering something under his breath. Judge Blake scribbled notes. "Continue." Daniel presented the next exhibit, my grandfather's letter, the handwritten one Caleb had tried to destroy. It looked fragile under the courtroom lights, but the words glowed like fire. He read it aloud. "If one day they tell you, there's nothing left for you, don't believe it. The truth always leaves a trace." Carmichael stood again. "Your Honor, that letter is decades old, irrelevant." The judge cut him off. "It establishes intent." Overruled. For a moment the courtroom was still. Then Mom's voice broke the quiet. "He didn't understand," she said suddenly, rising from her seat. "He was sick. Confused. You're twisting everything," the judge's gavel hit once. "Mrs. Monroe, sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt." She froze, then sank back into her chair. Caleb wouldn't look at her. Daniel turned back to the bench. "One final piece, Your Honor." He handed up the form labeled "Under Duress." My father's signature sat beneath the words, "Temporary Trustee Ellen Monroe." Next to it, a scrawled note from the law firm client appeared physically distressed during signing. The judge's face softened just slightly. "I've seen enough." Daniel nodded. The plaintiff rests. The defense had nothing. Carmichael shuffled papers, whispering to Mom. Caleb kept glancing at the gallery at the reporters, scribbling every word. The judge tapped her pen against the desk. "Given the evidence, the court finds substantial cause to freeze the Monroe Family Trust pending investigation. Effective immediately, all financial assets are suspended. Medical guardianship will revert to neutral oversight until further notice." Mom inhaled sharply. Caleb muttered something I couldn't hear. Judge Blake looked at me. "Miss Monroe, this isn't over. But for now, you've earned the court's attention." I nodded, unable to speak. When the gavel fell, the reporters surged forward. Flashbulbs popped, voices overlapped. Daniel put a hand on my shoulder and guided me out through a side door. In the hallway, the echo of the courtroom still clung to me, the gasps, the gavel, my mother's voice breaking. I felt both lighter and exhausted, like I'd been holding my breath for years and had finally exhaled. Daniel handed me a copy of the court order. "It's a temporary win," he said. "They'll regroup, try something new." "I know," I said. "But today was the first time they couldn't talk over me." He smiled faintly. "Get some rest. You'll need it." Outside, the cold air hit like a slap. The reporters were still out front, but I ignored them, heading for the parking lot. My reflection in a car window stopped me. Hair, windswept eyes, rimmed red, but something fierce behind them. I barely recognized myself, and for once, that felt like a good thing. When I got home, the sun was setting, turning the city gold. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the fridge. I dropped my bag on the chair and went to turn off the lamp. That's when I noticed it, an envelope on my desk, cream-colored, no stamp, no return address. Someone had been inside. Again. My breath caught as I picked it up. On the front, in neat handwriting, "He left more than you think." The paper trembled between my fingers. For a long moment, I just stood there, the city buzzing faintly outside my window. Then I sat down, laid the envelope on the table, and whispered to the empty room, "All right, Dad. Show me what you left." The envelope sat on my desk like it was breathing. "He left more than you think." The words were written in a familiar slant, steady but pressed too hard, like whoever wrote them had been shaking. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, afraid of what it might take from me or give back. When I finally tore it open, the smell of old paper hit me first. Inside were 3 things. A small black USB drive, a brass key with scratches along its edges, and a folded letter on thin stationery that still carried a faint trace of cedar and engine oil. The letter began in my father's handwriting. "If you're reading this, Rachel, it means you finally stopped trying to protect them." My throat closed up. "You always wanted to believe the best in people. That was your strength, but in this family it was also your weakness. I should have told you the truth sooner. I thought I could fix it quietly, but I was wrong." The words blurred for a moment as tears filled my eyes. He'd written it hastily, the ink darker in some places, like the pen had pressed too deep. "They forced my hand, Rachel. Ellen and Caleb said they'd cut me out of the business and move the money if I didn't sign the new trust. I knew what it meant, but I also knew if I refused, they'd do worse. So I made copies, recorded what I could, and hid what was left for you." He'd underlined that last part twice. "I couldn't stop them without losing everything, so I hid what I could for you. There's a bank account under your name at First Sound Bank. I kept it clean, untouched. It's not much, but it's yours, the last honest thing I had to give. The letter ended with a line that tore through me. If they ever come for you, don't shout. Just show the truth. It's louder. I folded it slowly, my hands trembling. For a long time I just sat there, the world silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Then I picked up the USB and slid it into my laptop. The screen flickered. Static, then a low hum, and finally his voice, weak but steady. Ellen, stop. She deserves her share. My mother's voice followed, sharp as glass. She doesn't need it. She's always fine. She'll survive like she always does. Then Caleb, cold and impatient. Dad, sign it or we lose everything. You don't even know what you're risking. There was a pause, a soft exhale that sounded like defeat, then the faint scratch of a pen on paper. I pressed a hand to my mouth. My father's voice came again, quieter this time. Forgive me, Rachel. The recording ended with a click. The silence that followed was unbearable. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and cried, not loud, just the quiet kind that comes from somewhere too deep to touch. When I looked down again, the brass key was still lying on the table. I picked it up, running my thumb over the grooves. It looked familiar. Then I remembered my father's old safe deposit box at First Sound Bank. I'd gone with him once when I was a kid. He'd told me it was where the real stuff lived. The next morning I drove downtown. The air was crisp, the sun weak but visible behind the clouds. The bank lobby was almost empty, the marble floors shining too bright. When I approached the counter and handed the key to the teller, she frowned. Safe deposit number 1117, I said. It belonged to David Monroe. Her eyes flicked up at me. And you're his daughter. Rachel Monroe. She hesitated, then checked her computer. Something in her posture changed. One moment, please. She disappeared into the back, returning with a small metal box and a manager. The man smiled politely. We've been instructed to release this only to you, he said. Your father left explicit authorization. My chest tightened. When, 2 years ago, they led me into a small room with beige walls and a single table. The box clicked open with the key, the sound echoing in the quiet. Inside were a leather-bound notebook, another sealed envelope, and a thick folder labeled Monroe Estate, Original Trust. My hands shook as I lifted the folder. The first page was the original will, signed, notarized, and dated before any of the forged revisions. My name appeared clearly as the principal heir and trustee. Not Caleb, not Ellen, me. Beneath it were account statements showing transfers from the family trust into personal accounts under my mother's and brother's names. Each withdrawal marked personal business expense. There was no denying it now. They hadn't just taken my inheritance. They'd stolen from the man lying unconscious in a hospital bed. The notebook beneath the papers was full of my father's handwriting, dates, numbers, short notes in the margins. Caleb withdrew again, one entry read. Another said Ellen wants to sell the house. Told her no. The last entry stopped my breath. If Rachel finds this, tell her I finally did one thing right. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear hit the page. I pressed my palm flat over his words, whispering, You did, Dad. You did. When I left the bank, the light outside was soft and gold. The city felt quieter than usual, like it was holding its breath for me. I walked down to the river, the one that cut through downtown like a scar, and stood there for a while, watching sunlight ripple across the water. The wind was sharp but clean. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was drowning in my family's lies. I'd found the truth, and it was heavier than I expected, but it was mine. I called Daniel as I walked back to the car. He picked up on the second ring. I found it, I said. The original will, everything. There was a pause, then his voice softened. Then it's over. I looked at the sky, streaked with pale blue between the clouds. Not over, I said quietly. But it's finally clean. The words hung there for a long moment. When I ended the call, I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, letting the sun warm my face through the windshield. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I didn't want revenge. I didn't want them ruined or punished. I just wanted to stop carrying the weight of what they'd done. The truth had already done the work for me. I turned the key in the ignition, and as the engine hummed to life, I whispered to the empty seat beside me, "You can rest now, Dad." Outside, the light on the river shimmered like a promise. 2 months after finding the original will, the court finalized everything. I didn't even attend the last hearing. Daniel called that morning while I stood by the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee gone cold. "It's done," he said. The judge voided the forged documents. Everything's back where it should have been. For a second, I didn't know how to react. No celebration, no tears, just quiet. I watched the city moving outside, people heading to work, buses groaning through intersections. The world didn't pause to witness justice. It never does. But inside, something shifted, a release I hadn't realized I was waiting for. I went to see my father that afternoon. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and faint lavender. He looked smaller than I remembered his face, pale but peaceful. I pulled a chair close and sat, setting the photo of our family on the nightstand beside him. The same picture from when I was 10, taken before everything cracked. "I found your letter," I whispered. "And the will. You did it, Dad." His chest rose and fell slow and steady. I unfolded his note again, tracing the words I'd memorized by now. "If they ever come for you, don't shout, just show the truth. It's louder." I read it out loud, my voice trembling halfway through. The room was still except for the faint hum of machines. For the first time, the silence didn't hurt. It just existed. I placed the key from the bank beside his hand and said softly, "You can rest now. I'll take it from here." As I stood to leave, sunlight broke through the window blinds, thin golden lines stretching across the floor. For a moment, it looked like forgiveness made visible. A week later, my mother asked to meet. Her lawyer emailed Daniel saying Ellen wanted to talk privately before leaving town. I almost said no, but curiosity won over exhaustion. We met at a small cafe by the harbor-neutral ground public safe. She looked different. The woman who used to command every room now sat hunched, her posture unsure. Her lipstick was lighter, her hair grayer. When she saw me, she tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. Neither was I. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the sound of gulls cut through the wind. "I wanted to believe I was protecting the family," she said finally, her voice thin. I stirred my coffee. "You weren't protecting the family. You were protecting control." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't argue. "Do you hate me, Rachel?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who'd spent her life arranging everyone else's stories like flowers in a vase, pruning truth until it looked good in the picture. "No," I said after a moment. "But I stopped needing you to love me." She nodded slowly, tears gathering but never falling. "He loved you," she whispered. I took a breath. "I know." When I stood to leave, she reached out, fingers trembling, but stopped short. There was nothing left to hold. As I walked away, I realized it wasn't victory that filled me, it was peace. The kind that comes when there's finally nothing left to fight about. Spring came early that year. The rain softened the trees outside my father's old house, began to bloom again. I moved in quietly without ceremony. It didn't feel like claiming property, it felt like reclaiming air. The first few weeks I spent cleaning, painting, rebuilding. The walls that once carried arguments now smelled of fresh paint and lemon oil. In the corner of the living room, I found my mother's old flower shop sign tucked behind a cabinet. The glass house. I wiped off the dust and set it by the front window. It felt poetic to keep the name, but this time it would mean something else. I turned the old shop into a small community space, a workshop where people could paint, plant, talk, and rebuild. Survivors of family betrayal, people learning how to live without apology, healing through creation. Every morning I opened the doors and watched light spill across the floorboards. The place didn't erase the pain, it just gave it somewhere to go. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking to Dad while I watered the plants. "You were right," I'd say. "Things grow again when you stop cutting them too early." One afternoon, as I was rearranging some tulips near the window, a small envelope slid through the mail slot. No name, just my address. Inside was a short note, written in uneven handwriting. "I'm sorry. You were right. Caleb." I stood there for a long time staring at it. Then I walked to the back garden, dug a small hole beside the rose bush, and buried the note under the soil. Forgiveness didn't need witnesses. Months passed and the world kept moving. Ellen sold the condo and moved down south to stay with relatives. Caleb vanished into another city, another name. I didn't follow their stories. I didn't need to. One morning in late April, I unlocked the shop early. The sun rose pale over the hill, spilling soft light through the glass. The tables were lined with plants waiting to be repotted, brushes in jars, clay still damp from yesterday's class. A few students began to arrive, women and men carrying their own versions of broken stories. I greeted them with coffee and a smile. They didn't know every detail of mine, just enough to know I understood. When the session started, I stood in front of the group and said, "My name's Rachel. I used to think helping meant giving until there was nothing left. But I've learned love without limits becomes permission. Sometimes choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's sacred." A few people nodded, others wiped their eyes. One man raised his hand and asked quietly, "So what happened to your family?" I smiled just a little. "They learned how to live within their means," I said, "and I learned how to live without their approval." The group laughed softly, the kind of laughter that heals instead of mocks. After everyone left, I sat by the window watching the rain start again, a gentle drizzle that made the world look new. I thought of my father's letter, my mother's tired eyes, my brother's shaky apology. For the first time, none of it hurt. It just existed like old scars that no longer ache when it rains. That evening, I poured a glass of wine and walked out to the porch. The neighborhood was quiet except for the soft hum of distant traffic. Across the street, a kid was learning to ride his bike, his mother cheering him on from the sidewalk. The sound made me smile. On the small table beside me was the old photo of my family. I traced my father's face with my fingertip. "We're okay now," I whispered. For years I thought revenge was the only way to make things right. But, standing there in the golden light of sunset, I understood. Sometimes the truest revenge is peace, the kind they can't take away from you. If you've ever had to walk away from a family that broke, you know this healing isn't weakness. It's strength. Tell me your story. I'll be here listening. Because peace, real peace, isn't found in the silence they leave behind. It's the one you build for yourself.